All right, hello, fellow headbangers. It's that time once again. My name is Alan, and let's talk some metal. Tonight, I thought I'd spend some time talking about a little bit of death metal. Last few videos have been more on traditional 80s stuff, so trying to mix things up here and there a little bit, and for you to do something on a little heavier genre. And for a topic, I figured I would do something that is a little more centric to my experience with death metal. And I'm going to talk about the three heavy metal bands, or the three death metal bands in particular, that kind of revived my interest in death metal. You see, by the end of the late 90s and into the early 2000s, I had gotten pretty burned out on death metal. Again, I started really paying attention to heavy metal in the late 80s and early 90s with cutting my teeth on thrash bands, Iron Maiden, stuff like that. So I was aware of a lot of, the first wave of death metal when it started breaking big in the earliest 90s. But as anyone who lived through that knows, there were a glut of bands that poured out. And a lot of them were very samey. It really took over the heavy metal landscape in the United States, especially for the first half of the 1990s. You were either listening to death metal or you were listening to Pantera and Biohazard and that kind of stuff. There wasn't really much room left for anything in between. So death metal sort of wore out its welcome with me over the years. And the bands that I liked most were bands like Bolt Thrower and early Obituary, bands that either went for like a doomier vibe or still had a strong sense of melody worked in. But it seemed as we got deeper into the 90s, the bands that proliferated the most were the ones that went for the more brutal aspects, the Dying Fetus and the Cannibal Corpse clones and such. And those bands just never appealed to me as much, just my personal taste within death metal. So yeah, moving into the 21st century, death metal was not something I was paying a lot of attention to. Now, as we went through the early 2000s, there were a couple of releases here and there that would pop up that got my attention. I'd always kind of make sure I kept an eye on things. So we'll start out with a few of these honorable mentions, so to speak. One of them that came out in 2006 was the reunion album from Celtic Frost, Monotheist. This is an album that, when the project was announced and the album first came out, I had zero interest in. I like a lot of early classic Celtic Frost stuff, but I was so not interested in hearing what the band was going to try to do as a reunion comeback kind of thing. Let's face it, a lot of those comeback projects are mediocre at best, and that's being kind of diplomatic about it. I'm kind of the opinion that a lot of those bands, you can't recapture that magic 20, 30 years later. You're not going to have that same youthful energy. Your view of the world is very different. And most of the time, you're not going to add anything really meaningful to the legacy of your band. And if you want to come back, do some reunion shows and such, hey, of course, it's your choice. I'm not saying you can't do it or you shouldn't. I'm just saying I don't tend to get much out of them myself. So I heard Celtic Frost was coming back out. It's just like, okay, there's another one that's giving it another turn, whatever. But eventually, it turned out I was working on a lab project out in California for several weeks. I got sent out there to help a professor with a project that went hilariously bad, or would have been hilarious if I didn't waste 3 weeks on it. But down the street from where I was staying was a Tower Records, and since the project was sort of a bust, I ended up spending a lot of time just browsing around in there. This was one of the things that had recently come out, and I figured, what the heck? Sitting around here just killing time in their lab, might as well have some good music to listen to. I'll give it a chance. So I picked it up and was really impressed with what I heard. This was a fantastic comeback. They still have something that's very Frost about it, but it's also unique. It's not just a rehash of something they did before. It's not another off-the-wall or avant-garde experiment or really out-there project. It's not dull. Really, really hit the nail on the head. So I was very impressed and still gets played on regular rotation. So that was one from 2006 that was kind of like, okay, there's maybe still some decent death metal here and there. And of course, the follow-ups with Triptychon, both of their albums kind of follow up on that monotheist formula a bit. doing it a little bit different, of course, but doing that same sort of, dark, heavier, doomier, slower sound, but still has a little bit of that, distinct Celtic Frost imprint on it for sure. All right, another one that popped up sort of there in the mid-2000s that caught my attention was this band, Necros Christos and Tryon Impunity Rights. To be honest, I don't really know why this album got on my radar, because again, I wasn't paying attention to a lot of this type of stuff at the time, but for whatever reason, this one got my attention somehow, and I decided to give it a chance, and I was really glad I did. Most folks should be familiar with this band. If not, they were German. They play a style that, in a way, owes a little bit to Celtic Frost. It's sort of, a simpler, stripped-down style of death metal. It's got, a good sense of melody to it. They go very heavy for, some of the occult kind of themes and all that. But it really clicked with me. And so, this was a band I kept up with as they released some of their other albums. Second album, Doomed to the Occult, was also very good. They put out a collection of 2 CD collection with a lot of their early demo type stuff on it. So at this point, they've called it a day, at least to my knowledge, unless they've also gotten back together. But they also have some EPs out there. Nine Graves is pretty good. And their last album was kind of a triple album, although it's divided up in a weird way. But still good stuff. They have a tendency to include lots of these little short sort of interludes in between the songs. And sometimes those are okay. They help create a mood and an atmosphere, but sometimes they also just feel like they kind of drag things out a little bit. So sometimes you kind of want to edit those out of your playlist and just get to the good songs. All right, one more honorable mention to throw up here. 2009 saw the comeback of a band from back in the 90s that had only released a little EP, but I'd picked it up tape trading, was always impressed by it, and so I was happy to see the return of France's Calissia. If you're not familiar with this band, don't feel bad. Again, their output has been very, very minor. They did an EP called Skies back around 1995. I think it was on the Adipashare label, which didn't have great distribution, especially in the US. It was this very unique style of death metal that was sort of progressive. It was very airy sounding. It wasn't as, far out there as, say, Cynic's Focus or anything, but it was a very ambitious sounding band. You could tell they were trying to do something a little more different. But then the band went dormant for a long time. They had some side projects that also did some stuff that was kind of interesting. And there was always talk that the, main band member was working on this, sort of big concept album. And it was one of those things that just kind of hung out there forever, like that unreleased Watchtower album, for example. But 2009 finally did see the release of Sibion, and it's a pretty cool release. It's very long. It's a concept album that sort of tells this, futuristic sci-fi tale with, sort of, genetically manipulated, super beings going out amongst the stars and all that, but whatever. So again, cool listening. And it was one of those things that's like, oh, hey, there's a cool death metal thing. Let's pick that up too. All right, but again, kind of real spotty record as far as I was concerned through the early 2000s. So then we're going to fast forward to 2015 is the year that I caught wind of some things that really got me reinterested in death metal and paying more attention to releases on a regular basis again. So I want to talk about 3 bands in particular that really revived my interest. And most of these, to be clear, I caught wind of them about the time their second album was coming out. So I'm not claiming any extra, true metal street cred here for, oh, I saw that band as soon as they released their first demo. No, I picked up most of these bands about the time album number 2 came out. And why 2015? Why did I stumble across them all at that time? Well, they were all releasing their second album right around then, more or less. It was also a time when I was doing a heck of a lot of walking because every day I was taking my little boy, who was newborn at the time, out for rides in a stroller. So I would walk him up and down the street through our block, could do it slowly, give him like a good hour walk outside with fresh air, get me some exercise, give him time to sort of fall asleep and take a nap, or, goo goo and gaga at the birds and stuff going by. And I just would put on my headphones, and I didn't have time to go shopping for a lot of music, so I was using the e-music service at the time. And these were just things that kind of caught my eye. I was like, well, what the heck, I'll give it a try. And I ended up really getting into the bands. So I'd be, pushing a 1-year-old around in a stroller. Everyone in the neighborhood's like, oh, that's so cute. And I'm listening to all this, really new death metal that had caught my ear. Don't think they quite knew what I was listening to. Anyway, the first band that really got my notice, I was like, oh, I got to check out more of these guys, was Horrendous. Now, this is their debut album, The Chills, and really, really liked this one when I heard it. It had, a very sort of good old school death metal sound, but it had really good energy to it. This wasn't a band that was just trying to be brutal for the sake of being brutal. They weren't trying to sound old school just as a, hey, look how retro we are or anything. I'll admit, it didn't hurt matters any that, they had roots in Columbia, South Carolina, which is my old stomping ground. So it's kind of like, hey, what do you know? Columbia actually got another death metal band out there that's not bad. But yeah, very cool album. It has a very creepy vibe to it. I really like the production, the way the sound comes out. A lot of really cool songs. Altars is my favorite without a question, but really interesting band. And again, I picked up on them around the time their second album had come out. This one, Ecdysis. And this is a band that has been changing rapidly from album to album. By the time Ecdysis came out, they were really shedding that sort of creepy melodic style and developing into something more akin to Heartwork and Swan Song era Carcass is the thing that immediately kind of caught my ear. It was the first song on this album in particular, The Stranger, that hooked me on the band. I was just like, yeah, I'm downloading that whole album, paying for it through eMusic. And after hearing a few times, like, yeah, I'm tracking down some more albums by that band. That is really cool. So again, by this point, they're going for a more technical sound, cleaning it up a lot. Again, a sort of heavier Carcass influence on this one. Since this, the band has released 2 more albums. I don't have hard copies of those. I will still pay to download some things. Can't buy physical copies of everything. But each album has kind of gotten more and more on the progressive and techie side of death metal. They're not bad albums at all, but I feel like they're kind of drifting in a direction that I'm eventually going to lose interest in. The third album, I think is Aneta, is still pretty good. There are songs on that one I like. The most recent one, which I think was called Idols. Check me show notes over here real quick. Idol. Yeah, that one, to be honest, didn't really catch my attention on the first couple of listens. So I feel like, they're still doing good music. They're obviously very talented musicians and songwriters, but I think they're going in a direction that, probably isn't for me. But those first couple albums, especially The Chills, that's an excellent death metal album. All right, on those same buggy walks up and down the street, also checking out this band. Now, the past 6 months or so during the pandemic, I've been listening to a lot of metal YouTuber content. I don't think I've heard a single person mention this band. And I think that's a real shame because I think they're really, really good. This is Chapel of Disease out of Germany. This is their first release, Summoning Black Gods. On this one, they again are doing sort of the old school death metal worship. I hear similarities to things like leprosy era death in particular. So it's not too brutal, it's not too technical. It's kind of hitting that sweet spot right there in the middle where I tend to like my death metal. Lyrically, this one pays a lot of homage to H.P. Lovecraft, which is almost cliche at this point among death metal bands. One thing I like about Chapel of Disease, though, is, again, they always keep a very good sense of melody in their songs. It's not just heavy for the sake of heaviness. They understand how to write songs and how to write melodies that are going to stick with you long after the album has finished playing. So again, this is their first one. It's recently been reissued, so it's a lot easier to find than it used to be. But again, that wasn't the album I first caught them on. The album that I heard first was album number 2, which is this one called The Mysterious Ways of Repetitive Art. And this one again shows the band was already evolving in different directions, kind of like Horrendous. They did their old school death metal album, got themselves started, but they quickly started moving in a new direction. On this album, the sort of melodic elements are taking more of the foreground, and at times there start to be elements almost of a little bit of death and roll mixed in, but it's done very, very well here. There's a lot of rocking out on some of the guitar solos, for example. Lord of All Death is sort of the key track here, where it has this very long middle section where they're just jamming for fun and really doing the guitar heroics, and it's really cool. It's not something you always hear a ton of in death metal, or when you hear it, it's done where it's coming from this very technical standpoint, and that's not what Chapel of Disease is trying to do at all. So really liked this album. It's pretty unique sounding in my opinion. They've since done a third album, which has a ridiculously long album title. Again, it's one I've downloaded from and paid for. It's called And As We Have Seen the Storm, We Have Embraced the Eye. That one came out in 2018. And that album kind of goes a little bit further into the death and roll style. So again, they're stripping away the heavier, sort of more deathy components and going in that direction. It still works very, very well for them. The first half of that album is really good. Some of the tracks on the second half drag out a little bit too long, in my opinion, but it's still a good album and a band that I'm keeping an eye on for sure moving forward. Quick note, Chapel of Disease is on the Van record label out of Germany, which is also home to the third and last band that I'm going to mention, which is Sulfureon. This is arguably my favorite death metal band that's up and going these days. And this is another one that I caught onto right there around late 2014 or early 2015, doing those buggy pushes and buggy rides with my little boy. Another German band, another band on the Van label. If you haven't figured out by now, Van's got a pretty good lineup. They're also the current home of Atlantean Codex, who are my favorite heavy metal band, bar none, on the planet at this moment. Sulfureon, some things that stand out about them quickly. Another band that's doing the Lovecraft thing. They tend to get excellent artwork for the album covers done. This is the first album, Swallowed by the Ocean's Tide. And yeah, it's pretty much, Cthulhu, followed by Cthulhu, followed by, let's mix it up with some Yog-Sothoth, and let's do another Cthulhu song. You would think they'd run the risk of the material getting a little stale, sticking to that formula for the lyrics, but it works very, very well. They really know how to work that in. Something that helps a little bit is the band isn't afraid to work in some slightly blackened elements to their music. I consider this death metal, but I've heard some folks refer to it more as almost melodic death metal or melodic black metal. That, they're working a little bit of that Swedish sound of stuff like early Cemetery, maybe a hint of Dissection here and there. And so it gives the band a sort of more unique flavor. They had done a demo and an EP before this, and they got their sound established pretty quickly. This is my favorite of their 3 albums, and again, it's because this one, they are really working in those melodic strands more. It's a very heavy album, very dark, but still, lots of good songwriting hooks along the way. They've done 2 more albums since then. Their second is this one, Gateway to the Antisphere. Again, amazing cover art they're getting done for these things. On vinyl, this is done as a gatefold. That looks great. The CD, of course, packaging doesn't really do it as much justice. On this album, they changed directions just slightly. This album has a more brutal and more technical feel to it. Now, it's not going overboard into like progressive death metal or anything like that, but they're definitely focusing on the technicality and turning up the brutality, and that's replacing some of the slightly more melodic side that Swallowed by the Ocean's Tide had on it. So this one, for me, it's a good album, but it doesn't have a lot of those standout moments or really memorable songs like the debut did. So this one was kind of a step down for me. Their most recent one from 2018, which again I've bought via Bandcamp, don't have a physical copy of yet, Scythe of Cosmic Chaos. And that one kind of backs off the technicality a little bit. If anything, it goes for a little bit more of a doomier vibe worked into the music. It almost falls a little bit in between albums 1 and 2. It's very, very good. I'm very happy with the third album. I like it a lot. And so that's another band that I'm really interested to see how they do moving forward. And so since then, of course, the past few years, we've seen lots and lots of really good and interesting death metal bands turn up or quickly evolve from, the first demo stage onto other things. No need to reel off all the different names of the two molds and blood incantations and ulthars out there. We're obviously kind of a death metal renaissance going on these days, which is really cool to see. But yeah, it's those three bands, Horrendous, Chapel of Disease, and Sulfureon, they kind of got me back into the fold, got me to finally put down my stack of 1980s heavy metal vinyl and start paying attention to what some of the heavier acts were doing again. And I'm really glad I did. All right, that's all I've got for tonight. So let's talk metal in the comments down below. What are your favorite death metal bands that have cropped up in the past 5 or so years? Did you go through a similar drought? I know I've heard some other YouTube content creators comment that, in the late 90s and earliest 2000s, they had also gotten really sick of what death metal had turned into. There was just too many bands doing the same thing. Did you take a break from death metal? And if so, what band or what album kind of got you back into it and got you really excited to start hearing things again? Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. And until the next video, make sure to keep banging your heads.